Thanks very much. I want to start by reminding ourselves, I guess, that in 2006, the fiscal situation of the Irish state was such that a surplus of 3% of the gross domestic product was run. That is, the Irish state was not running a deficit. It was not increasing its debt. In fact, its debt was quite low. Now, a sensible economic policy would have resulted in much less explosive growth, but a sensible tax policy would have brought in a much greater percentage of tax revenues. So in general, I think that just a few short years ago, Ireland, despite being as misgoverned as it has been, was essentially solvent. By 2009, the deficit was 14% of GDP. By 2010, the deficit was 31% of GDP. Now, absent the bank bailout of Anglo and Irish Nationwide, this deficit would not have been 31%. This deficit would have been 11.5%. Not something to be proud of, not something to write home about, but certainly not 31%. Adding the 31% brought Irish debt to close to, accumulated debt, to close to 100% of GDP. And what I want to emphasize with these figures is that the problem that we face today is not the consequence of profligate spending. And you'd think it was, listening to the political debate from virtually all sides. And the problem was not that we're paying ourselves too much. The problem that Ireland faces in its fiscal position is twofold. There are two things which contribute to this problem, and the first is the bank bailout. And the second is the Depression. We usually call it a recession. It might be a recession in the United States. In Ireland, it's very much a depression. And this depression is most particularly manifest in the domestic economy. In fact, Irish exports are doing moderately well. But we've seen a collapse of consumer spending, a collapse in domestic investment, and drastic cuts in government spending. Consumer spending, investment spending, and government spending together constitute the domestic part of our economy. Worse than this, we've seen a solution in quotation marks, imposed. Well, I think we ought to talk a little bit perhaps later on about to what extent this is imposed and to what extent this is voluntarily accepted by Irish ruling elites. But we've been forced to borrow 67.5 billion from the EU IMF, quote, bailout, unquote, at punitive interest rates. We've got a combined interest rate of about 5.82%, and it's only that low because the IMF offered us a better rate than our so-called friends in the European Union. What's to be done with this money? A great deal of it is intended to be thrown into the black hole of the banks. We required, as a condition of this money, to cut a further 15 billion on top of the 15 billion, which has already been cut from the government budget, in order to bring the deficit down to 3% of GDP by 2014. Actually, the IMF or the IMF EU requirement is 2015, but our friends in Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil have moved the deadline forward a year. Will this work? These cuts and the interest payments on the borrowed money will simply drain money out of the economy, forcing down growth and forcing further cuts in order to meet the targets. So Irish recovery cannot be the motivation for the imposition of this program. What is the motivation? The motivation is to force Ireland to save the European financial system from the effects of Irish default and pay interest for the privilege. Will this work even in its own terms? I think increasingly, even establishment economists and financial analysts are coming to doubt whether this will in fact save the Irish economy from default. What will our politicians do? Well, we can have a look at their electoral programs for what that tells us. Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, and the Green Party have all put forward a 4-year plan to cut the 15 billion, 2/3 cuts in spending, 1/3 tax increases. It's interesting to note here that the Fine Gael plan is identical. Astonishingly, it's identical to the Fianna Fáil plan. And these are the people who are going to be largely in charge of the next government, or perhaps, if we're unlucky, solely in charge of the next government. Labour is not that much better. Labour has put forward a 6-year plan rather than a 4-year plan, and sensibly wants the proportion between cuts and taxes to be half and half. These parties have discussed, to a certain extent, not burning the bondholders, perhaps singeing them a little bit. And this particularly bank bondholders. They've talked about renegotiating the interest rates, but renegotiating the interest rates in the region of 1% or less. It's bothered me a lot trying to figure out what is the motivation for this, since, again, it cannot be Irish recovery, and I can only conclude that our political parties owe more loyalty to Europe and the international financial system than they do to either the Irish people or even the Irish state. Sinn Féin and the United Left Alliance have proposed a different program, specifically no drawdown of the EU IMF bailout, the burning of the bank bondholders, the spending of existing cash reserves to keep the state going, taxing the wealthy, and returning to the bond market with a smaller debt and a more secure tax base based on, again, wealth taxes. I think this program has a great deal more to recommend it than has generally been admitted by the Irish media. Nevertheless, it leaves unanswered the question, how are we to raise the cash to pay for the necessary jobs program which is needed to pull Ireland out of the depression? I don't think there's an answer to this question in the various political programs. I think there's a more radical possibility which we need to consider, and that's specifically leaving the euro. Because leaving the euro would leave us with our own currency, the ability to determine our own financial priorities, and to spend the money which is needed to pull the economy out of the depression into which it's fallen. There are a couple of further knock-on consequences to leaving the euro which we would need to consider. And the first is default on the sovereign debt as well as the bank debt. That is, if we move out of the euro into our own currency, we will not be able to pay off debts denominated in euros. And consequently, leaving the euro will raise the question of sovereign default. Will we be destroyed forever by sovereign default? I think the previous presentation on Argentina raises serious questions about that objection. Further, we would have to institute capital controls to prevent money leaving the economy in the weeks after they change over to the euro. Even if we were to lose our nerve at this point and back away, the threat of default is absolutely essential to any kind of renegotiation of the IMF deal. If it's true that we can bring down the European financial system, that's one hell of a bargaining chip. And I'll leave it there.